It really gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this keynote controversy panel discussion. Is populism a response to two-tier rule? Question mark. We wanted to dig a bit deeper into the rise of populism, particularly internationally. Why are populist parties breaking through the glass ceiling of mainstream political life? From Marie Le Pen's RN in France to the right wing and the left wing populist parties in Germany. And of course, you've got Meloni in Italy, we've got events in Austria, and we've even got Reform UK, potential populist rebellion in the UK too. But there's also street rebellions, European farmers' protests, anti immigration movements breaking out. So we don't want to just ask why, but we want to think this is being responded to by the different establishment and authority figures. What does it say about political legitimacy? We ask the question about two-tiered governance because it does sometimes feel as though if you describe yourself as a populist, and I often am labeled a populist and have decided now, rather than kind of being defensive, I'm just going to say, yes, I am. Because maybe it means I'm popular, even if you're not. I suppose one of the things that's worrying is the way that sometimes a response to populism is to try and isolate it, quarantine it away, and basically say, they're nasty people, don't engage with them. And that does appear to me to be good for democratic norms. On the other hand, we're told by the establishment that populism is a threat to democratic norms. So lots to discuss here. Let me introduce the panel in the order in which they're going to speak. So Winston Marshall, who is a musician, he's a host of the ever-growing, in popularity and numbers, Winston Marshall Show. He's an increasingly vital political commentator, in my view. He was the founding member of Mumford and Sons, and that was a very successful career. What's really interesting now is that his new career, it seems to me, is overshadowing the success of musical career, and he's becoming internationally known as somebody that can get to the bottom of political issues, and his show asks all the right questions. And in fact, he's got his, as part of the podcast live series, he's got a discussion later, and one of the issues he's going to be tackling on the show with guests is the grooming scandal. And I think that indicates a certain bravery of being prepared to talk about issues that other people are frightened of. Then we'll be hearing from Sabine Beppler-Spahl, who is the chair of Freiblick Institute in Germany. Sabine and the Freiblick Institute organized the Berlin Salons, and they've been long-time collaborators of the Battle of Ideas Festival in terms of organizing the satellite events. And in fact, there will be satellite events coming up, and you should look at the website and see what's happening in Berlin. But they also work with the Ideas Matters team on putting on a fantastic day of Debating Matters schools debates, Debating Matters Berlin once a year, which is an extraordinary event involving schools in Germany. Sabine is also the author of a book in German on Brexit, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I'll be done for sort of microaggression. She's also the German correspondent for Spike. We're then going to hear from Bruno Waterfield. He's the Brussels correspondent at the Times. He's been reporting and commentating on European affairs for over 20 years. He's a long-standing speaker and chair at the Battle of Ideas, and we always trust him to put us under pressure and to ask interesting questions, so we're delighted to have him back. We're then going to hear from Dr. Roslyn Fuller, who is an expert on electoral systems, and books include Beasts and Gods, How Democracy Changed Its Meaning and Lost Its Purpose, and also In Defense of Democracy. Roslyn is the managing director of Solonian Democracy Institute based in Dublin, and is a regular speaker and media commentator, and describes herself as an acerbic and irreverent speaker. This is one of the reasons why we like her here at the Academy of Ideas and invited to speak at the Battle of Ideas. So welcome, Roslyn. And last but not least, Thomas Fazi, who is, I'm sure many of you read him. He's a columnist for Unheard, somebody that is a must-read columnist in my view, contributing editor also to the US magazine Compact. His books include Reclaiming the State, a progressive vision of sovereignty for a post-neo-liberal world, and also the very important The COVID Consensus, the Global Assault on Democracy, which is a book that critiqued what happened in lockdown from the left. And why that's very important is because sometimes when we have conversations about populism, for example, because it's become easy to demonize this as a far-right phenomenon so that kind of all good people will be embarrassed to be associated, Thomas has drawn attention very importantly to the fact that he says there's a rise of left populism. For me, it's neither left or right, but it's populism. But anyway, plenty to get stuck into. Let's start the discussion. Winston, could I ask you to kick us off, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire. So populism takes different forms in different nations, and I thought I might address populism in Britain. And you'll forgive me, please, if I start with some semantics, which I know are boring, but I think it's important that we're on the same page. Everyone agrees that populism exists, but there is not consensus on what it is exactly. When I debated Nancy Pelosi recently at the Oxford Union, she managed to present the cliched version of populism, conflating it with demagoguery and ethno-nationalism. The English political elite are not much better. Alistair Campbell, famous, of course, not just for being a lovely bloke, but also for his unwavering commitment to the pursuit of truth, called populism a virus. His trusted sidekick, closeted hard-left Labour supporter, Rory Stewart, regularly conflates populism with authoritarianism, polarization, and toxicity. But perhaps these two are opposed to populism because they are the Anton Deck of Westminster metropolitan elitism. They are about as in touch with the concerns of ordinary people as Jeremy Corbyn is now in touch with the leadership of Hamas. Populism is the politics of ordinary people in contention with an elite. And that's why I agree with Claire when she says it's not a right or a left thing, or rather it can take right or left forms. Two-tier rule, in contrast, whilst we all agree what it is, that different groups are treated differently by the police, judiciary, and legal system, there is no consensus that it exists. Prime Minister Starmer says, quote, "There is no two-tier policing. It's a non-issue." Even former Conservative Home Secretary Priti Patel denies that there is two-tier policing. So let me make the case that it exists. Two-tier rule is, this week, Lucy Connolly, wife of a Conservative councillor, being sentenced to 2.5 years for racist tweets that were deemed to be inciting violence at the time of the English riots. The same judge had sentenced a Sikh named Antonio Boparan to 18 months for killing a girl in a car accident when he was driving 80 miles an hour in 30. Boparan served only 8 months. Two-tier rule is 400 people charged after the English riots. Meanwhile, Mohammed Hassan, caught on CCTV beating 3 Asian women in Bradford. He was given a 6-month suspended sentence in August. Two-tier rule is Richard Williams, sentenced to 3 months in prison for a derogatory Facebook post during the riots. But the charges against the men driving around London in 2022 shouting from megaphones, "Fuck the Jews, fuck all of them, fuck their mothers, fuck their daughters, and show your support for Palestine," those men were not charged. Two-tier rule is this week Adam Smith Connor, criminally convicted for praying outside an abortion clinic. But no such legal proceedings for those praying on their knees towards Mecca, jubilantly chanting Allah Akbar in celebration outside the Israel Embassy in Kensington on October 8, 2023. Two-tier rule is Keir Starmer holding a press conference to announce a new national violent disorder program following the English riots, for making no such address to the nation following the violent riots in Hare Hills, Whitechapel, Rochdale, Southend, the violence and crime at Notting Hill Carnival, nor indeed after the Southport killing itself, which was more heinous than any of the riots that it inspired. But is populism a response to two-tier rule? Well, I need only remind you of the grooming gangs scandal. Thousands of girls and children sexually exploited decade after decade, up and down the country, from Telford to Bristol, Oxford to Rochdale, Birmingham to Huddersfield, specifically targeted because they were Kaffir. And perpetrators, predominantly of South Asian heritage, often left off the hook because of their ethnicity. Police, media, and politicians too cowardly to act, lest they be called racist. That scandal, no doubt, influenced the English riots, or the spirit that animated the riots. Those riots were openly hostile to Islam, despite the killer not being Muslim. Just as a specific predator from an asylum refuge, inspired the 2023 Knowsley riots in Liverpool when he made advances on a young teenage girl. It has no doubt influenced Tommy Robinson, leader of the Patriot Marches, a populist movement, whose own cousin was a victim of the grooming gangs. Farage himself, leader of Reform UK, has campaigned on the issue as well. There's no surer way to ignite the anger of men than attacking their daughters. That anger quickly became populist and anti-elite when it became obvious just how badly the elites had failed to deal with those crimes. Politicians, you'll remember Sarah Champion, who was made to quit the Labour front bench in 2017 after her Sun article on the issue of the grooming gangs. Two-tier rule is not the only cause behind populism. There are many, and in each country it is different. But two-tier rule, and specifically the grooming gang scandal, might be the most egregious reason behind populism in Britain. Thank you.
Perfect timing, Winston, and suitably provocative and thought-provoking to get us really stuck into this very important question. Sabine.
Yeah, so thank you, Claire. Well, who would have believed it a couple of years ago, but Germany is in the midst of a populist revolt. We know this, we've seen this especially this year with 4 quite important elections taking place, and the populists did tremendously well. Tremendously well is an understatement. So we had the right populist AfD coming second in 3 elections, including the EU election, and first in one election, which was called a historic election. It rattled the establishment to have the right populist AfD coming first in one of Germany's federal states. And this is despite another populist party having been founded only in January, calling itself a left populist party. There was, for a long time, a hope that the 2 populists would be taking votes away from each other, but they didn't. They both did tremendously well. The second populist party, the left populist party, also managed above 10-digit points in the elections it took part in. What got the establishment particularly scared was that it turned out that a lot of young voters were turning to the right populist AfD. The AfD is the most popular party at the moment amongst the under 30-year-old. And I think a person who spoke out the truth most clearest is not a populist, but a member of the government coalition, a liberal. His party has been virtually pulverized in these last elections. And he says the German government has lost its legitimacy. People have the impression that the ruling coalition is harming the country. It's not just bad, but harming the country. If such a significant proportion of voters refuse to support it, this must have consequences. The question is, which consequences? And I'm going to spend the rest of my little introduction to say that if you do sympathize with the establishment, you're right, you must be feeling very, very sad, because I'm going to argue that whatever they're trying to do, wherever they turn, they're bound to fail. They have lost so much touch with the national voter bases, or with a large sector of their voter bases, that they can't really do very much at all about it. Let's look at what they can do. They can go down the route of concessions, which they've tried to do. They're going to say, we're no longer tone deaf. We've understood your worries. We're going to do something about it. So they have actually introduced border controls on each of Germany's 9 national borders. which again is something a year ago nobody would have been unthought of. But here's the point. They're doing it. Everybody knows that they're doing it only as a result of the pressure they're under from the populists. And secondly, they are so aligned with their supranational thinking and their pro-EU thinking that they are very, very doing this very reluctantly. They hate doing it. And they're saying we're doing it only provisionally. So that's not going to win over or win back the people. The second reason why they're going to fail is because they are responding in their default way, resorting to authoritarianism. So as soon as the AFD won the elections, the first things the establishment said was, okay, you might have won, but you're never, ever going to form a government. You're not even going to have a say in this government. All the other parties are banding together, even if it means 3-party, 4-party coalitions to stop the AFD from coming into government. They're expelling the AFD from parliamentary working groups which any other party its size would be entitled to take part in. It's called the firewall strategy. And there are actually now even serious attempts to get the AFD banned again, meaning of having a party banned which 30% of the voters support. There's also attacks on free speech have been stepped up. I've just read last week that our economic and climate protection minister, that's his title, he's more climate protection than economic minister, I have to say, has filed 730 cases of criminal hate speech complaints against normal people. Why? Mostly for calling him an idiot. He's the one who decided to switch off our atomic power stations, by the way. Right. So, I mean, all that is really not going to fare well for the establishment. But the final reason why I think they are going to fail is that we have to remember this is the government which is finding it very, very hard to get the situation under control. People are really rubbing their eyes and looking at Germany at the moment and saying, what is happening to our country? There's quite a very serious sense of country falling apart. We're in a deep recession, second year in a row that our economy is declining. We have a perceived rise in crime, in organized crime. We had a series of 12 explosions in Cologne this summer with people being injured. We had a series of deadly Islamist attacks. The last one, which was luckily foiled, was only just last week against the Israeli embassy, I read. So these are things which are very, very unpleasant. The government doesn't like it, obviously. But they are saying, well, you know, we might be in a bad situation, but at least we're doing one thing. We're protecting democracy, we're protecting the state, we're protecting ourselves, and we're protecting you from the populists. So the fight against the populists, I would argue, has become one of the main bases of legitimization, the way the establishment tries to legitimize itself. They're calling the populists far right. That's going to be much harder to do with a new left populist party, by the way. But it's not washing with the people anymore. We see that. The AFD, I have to concede this, is a pretty unpleasant party in parts. It has some quite unpalatable people in it. But people don't mind. That's not what it's about. They're voting for the AFD because the populists have become the only force for change. And I think we're going to experience a period of great confrontations. Thank you.
I think that's really very helpful. And just to say, there is actually a lunchtime discussion specifically on what's happening in Germany, and which Sabine is going to be chairing after this. But it just reminded me of the great legal thinker in this country who on social media said, is there a way that we can get Reform UK MPs hounded out of Parliament? This was just after they'd been elected. And it's like, when people said isn't that a bit anti-democratic? He was outraged, right? He couldn't understand. It's like the ban on AFD, but it's also like the way it's being posed that anyone who votes for Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. So we see a lot of these trends. That was very helpful to Lena. Bruno.
Welcome to Barbieland. Yes, I said Barbieland. Welcome. That was the sneering response by one Berlin-based, I think, to the populist revolt that was so evident in pan-European Union elections this summer. It's unflattering. It's a comparison of the outlook of real voters
to an artificial, fake, delusional, and ultimately toxic world inhabited by rather dumb, as in stupid dolls. Worst of all, the election showed, the think tank concluded, a dangerous xenophobic drift, as many Europeans signalled their attachment to national politics and hostility to multiculturalism, but especially manifest in opposition to unquestioning acceptance of uncontrolled migration. As the ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, lamented, the EU's, quote, the EU's whiteness was on full display, and they despaired that, quote, drivers of discontent are behind a drift to ethnic Europeanness. The rise of Eurosceptic nationalist populist parties, which were the largest in EU elections in France, Italy, Belgium, Austria, Hungary, coming second in Netherlands and Germany, has horrified Europe's political elites. By painting the result as the triumph of whiteness, politics, democratic politics, is presented as something much darker, as the unleashing of deep, irrational ethnic forces that have, until now, been held in check by institutions such as the EU. The term whiteness is used to imbue the practice of politics, public space, and the practice of civic culture, its values and principles, with a toxic ethnicity. If Europeans, who are largely white, vote against the establishment. And now this is much more than a cordon sanitaire, a firewall, or in Germany, a Brandmauer to keep parties out of government. I mean, that has cracked. It is to draw new lines or new tiers of political inequality. It's a political conception of whiteness that redefines voters as literally revolting, toxic, moral inferiors, very much on the bottom tier. It is to redefine democratic politics itself, as published by most Europeans at the ballot box, as intrinsically ethnic. Any criticism of Western multiculturalism, which regards Europe's asylum system, very broken asylum system, as an axiom of political virtue, whatever the degree of dysfunction, is now equated with xenophobia. A big concern is that the whiteness of political culture makes Muslims feel uncomfortable requiring new limits on speech and ideas to prevent Islamophobia. It's no longer possible to deny, certainly for many voters, that the EU's institutions have failed to sufficiently safeguard, protect, or align with the public interest as defined by the public themselves, as opposed to officials, judges, NGOs, or elites. Any question of putting the national, the democratic, above the post-national or supranational EU is seen as xenophobia, seen as whiteness, as ethnic in character rather than a civic impulse. In fact, the EU's migration debate is an overwhelmingly civic question. It's about control. Who decides who should come, and the rules or obligations for people living on a territory that is ruled by a nation are public. Anger at the failures of the system, and they are legion and sometimes deadly, is overwhelmingly directed at political elites via the ballot box rather than an organised ethnic violence targeting migrants. The populist and nationalist revolt is basically a civic backlash against institutions and policies that have failed to address public interests that are historically and in reality situated nationally. For today's elites, democracy is not to be celebrated as an end in itself, but only as a means to legitimize an institutional order such as central banks, neoliberal economic models, refugee conventions, because they're post-national, embodied by the EU, for example. Populist revolt is not a march to achieve white supremacy. It's a backlash against notions of superiority that place institutions and decisions above the reach of the nation and people, treating us as uneducated, xenophobic, white, moral inferiors. Now, obviously, European elites are ethnically white on the whole, but they signal virtue by attacking whiteness, particularly when it's expressed by large groups of voters who are attached to the values, culture, or practices of their nation or territory, and do not dare to mention the word civilization. Elites are now much more identify with Muslims rather than the actual Arabs and Turks, who are mainly make up European immigrants, who are seen as a noble bastion against the whiteness of a majority. The civic realm is now painted as white, ethnic, and toxic, equating danger. Think of the cry, check your privilege. Free speech is itself seen as an oppressive whiteness. What's striking about the populist revolt, despite the political roots of some of its parties like the AfD in ethnic-based anti-democratic nationalism, is actually its civic character. It's a revolt at the ballot box. It's not the march of uniformed paramilitaries or skinheads breaking up meetings or beating up those who disagree with them. In fact, when it comes to council culture, shutting down debate and meetings or banning political distance, that realm is far more likely to be occupied by the avowedly liberal elites. Modern political culture, indeed our civilization itself, is founded on democracy and freedom and the practices of democracy and freedom. All important decisions forming the national interest should be taken by representative institutions controlled by the popular vote. This is a domain of freedom and free speech. There are no protected ideas, whether it's Eurozone austerity or the doctrine of a Catholic Church or a Muslim mosque. In the realm of democratic politics, there are no moral inferiors, no whiteness or brownness or blackness. We all equally have one vote. We all have the right to speak and decide.
Thank you very much.
So I think that's added another layer onto this discussion, and definitely one to consider exactly how populists are being characterized. But I think that emphasis that you've given us there on the civic nature of it versus the more unpalatable on the street stuff, is worth considering. And when I say unpalatable, it's inevitably the case that if the civic nature of populism is then ignored, what will the consequence be is worth considering. But anyway, Roslyn.
Thank you. Well, a populist used to be someone who cynically gave out cheap favors for personal gain. Whereas people who had a lot of friends, or they just did things that a lot of people liked, were popular. And in everyday language, that hasn't changed. No one ever says, I'm very concerned about my kids. They have a lot of friends. Everyone seems to like them. We're a little populist. But in political discourse, there's been an abrupt switch. Today, the Oxford Dictionary claims that populism is a type of politics that claims to represent the opinions and wishes of ordinary people. By this logic, Gandhi, JFK, and Martin Luther King were raging populists. In my view, this reframing of basic virtues into antichrist levels of vice is down primarily to economics. Over the past few decades, we've seen the broad middle class split into two. Or rather, to put it more accurately, part of this class, maybe 15% or so, split off from the rest and formed its own class. I call them courtiers. Others have called them the clerisy or dream hoarders. It's much of a muchness. Populism isn't a response to anything. Populism is just life as we know it by another name. It's courtierism that is the new thing. Courtiers are usually people whose houses are worth 4 or 5 times what they paid for them, they're getting really solid pensions, and they've been protected from the new economy. Their children, also courtiers, are currently benefiting from the greatest wealth transfer in history, and will therefore be even more sheltered. I'd like to stress that although there's definitely a correlation, it's not really about the absolute amount of money such people have. The crucial difference is whether you have a safety net provided for you or you live under actual market conditions, in which case you're much more likely to be a populist. Courtiers increasingly have jobs in what have become the courtiering industries. Media, academia, NGOs, fields where conformity has become important to survive, precisely because they're increasingly funded and run top-down, rather than by the membership, which was previously the case. In many meritocratic society, many of the courtiers would be sharply downwardly mobile, because it would be overtaken by competition coming from below. But since that's a non-starter, they throw in their lot and view themselves, erroneously, as being part of the very wealthy, and they're who are now the prime funders of their jobs. So hence, they are courtiers to those patrons. It keeps them alive and in pumpkin spice lattes one more day. When you're doing better than could reasonably be expected, any change is likely to be for the worse, especially anything that smacks of control, scrutiny, accountability, or tightening things up. And that is why for them, any politics of change is seen as fringe and dangerous. It is dangerous for them because they're one good inheritance tax regulation away from having their lives wrecked. Due to these life circumstances, there aren't really differences of opinion between courtiers and populists. There are differences of interest, which makes it much more vicious. 30 years ago, we all had friends who had major differences of opinion with us. Didn't really matter. You had all kinds of friends who had all kinds of crazy ideas. But the interests were much more uniform. You can change your opinion. You can't change your material interest, and definitely not just by thinking about it. So courtiers and their descendants really do live in an alternate reality, where blindly following the rules has turned out well for them. In their view, other people are justly punished for not making the same choices they did. Populism, on the other hand, comprising everybody else, is a surprisingly diverse field. You've got right-wing populists, left-wing populists, centrist populists, socialist populists, libertarian populists, all kinds of populists. But that very diversity is what makes it easier for the courtiers to split them. Their very conformity is an advantage in this regard. The courtier line, promulgated in the industries they dominate, is everyone is fringe and extreme, and anyone could turn out to be Hitler. You could be the person who enables the next Hitler. It's ironically a strategy that depends on people not being racist to be effective, but it's also really paralyzing. And the strategy has been to demonize and discard any major reform. Bernie, Corbyn, the Firestar movement in Italy, the right and left in France, whatever. Trump, of course, because of this, we've been caught in a political loop for years, with courtiers taking down everything that could possibly offer an alternative, and everyone else has been so caught off guard by their boundary-busting behavior that we floundered. So we need to endure circumvent them as a class that's essentially functioning as strike breakers of democracy. How to do that? 1, the populist left and right should get together. Should have happened a long time ago, and yes, it entails compromise, but really you would have thought 20 years ago that US Republicans would be running on an anti-war platform. There's a lot there. Fiscally conservative, socially liberal is definitely a pattern that's been extremely caught in the digital democracy exercises that I've done. 2, remove the courtier's economic advantages. A Cold War with Russia or China could have that effect if enough manufacturing is re-onshored. So even without attaining political power and changing specific rules, that's something that could happen. 3, let go of obsessing about wokeness. There are people who are obsessed with creating outrage in the name of wokeness, but there are also people who got just as obsessed with countering those outrages. Socialism gone too far becomes communism, conservatism gone too far becomes fascism, but liberalism gone too far becomes libertinism. I think we all know this now, and I'd like to say it was interesting, but it was a major win for the courtiers every single day, because every day that we're discussing some derivative outrage generation, we're not focused on constructive action. And finally, 4, regulate NGO funding. Massive amounts of funding flows from wealthy, often American endowments into thousands of NGOs and newspapers and schools every year, staffed by courtiers, almost all of it focused on offensively hysterical goals, generating more useless outrage because no one ever agreed to them. So it'd be the easiest thing in the world to regulate this away across the political spectrum. This would reopen space for grassroots movements and reader-led media to reappear. And that would let us find out what is actually popular.
Thank you very much. I love these introductions because they tell the story that you know in such imaginative ways that you think, oh, I've never thought of it like that. So I had Barbie Land, now I've had the courtiers. And anyway, that was fascinating. Thank you very much, Roslyn. Thomas, to finish off, please.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. So when I think of populism in Europe today, or maybe we should call it anti-establishmentarianism, which is probably more etymologically correct, even though it's not as sexy, so I'll stick to populism. But so my feelings are ambivalent. On the one hand, it's obviously a good sign. It's a sign of a relatively healthy body politic, a sign that despite the infinite money and resources that they deploy to brainwash people into getting them to support policies that are clearly against their interests, people are not buying it. So it turns out that there are limits to propaganda. That's a good sign. It's a sign that despite the existence in the West today of, I would say, the most sophisticated propaganda/censorship machine ever created in human history, you really can't convince people that it's sunny outside when it's actually pissing down with rain. And And again, that's a good thing. So, the limits to propaganda. So propaganda can't fully replace reality. And that's good. But it's not just propaganda. We've witnessed a decades-long attack on the very concept of popular democracy, on the idea that ordinary people should have a say in the management of society and, God forbid, the economy. This is what neoliberalism as a political project has been about, demobilizing and depoliticizing the democratic process by effectively insulating the decision-making process from any challenges from below, especially on the issues that matter, i.e. the economy and foreign policy, but also by fueling apathy, by getting people to accept that they should be mere spectators to the political game. And I think this has also been a form of psychological warfare in many ways, partly waged by demonstrating time and time again that people can vote for whomever or whatever they want, but this doesn't really matter in the end because the policies are decided elsewhere. And of course, Brexit is the most obvious example, one of the biggest FUs to the democratic principle ever, probably. And of course, part of it is to protect the status quo, obviously. But I think, it's quite clear to me that the aim is also to break people's spirits, to get them to accept that, just accept the fact that we live in an oligarchy, democracy is a scam, just go about your lives and stop, even thinking that you can influence this process because we're much more powerful than you. And yet, despite all this, despite this decades-long political process, they haven't succeeded in fully breaking people's spirits. Yes, of course, there's a lot of disillusionment around, understandably, evidence, for example, by declining rates of electoral participation and other examples. But the ongoing populist wave shows that a lot of people have not given up on the basic idea of having a say on their collective fate as peoples and countries, as nations. And this is rather exceptional. It's quite incredible, I would say. If we consider, again, the amount of money and resources that were thrown, precisely to stop people from even thinking that this was something that is conceivable. So, this is all very positive in my opinion. At the same time, I think we have to ask ourselves, are the populist parties currently in existence living up to this historic challenge? And at this point, I'm a bit less optimistic. So when I look at the current raft of right populist parties, again, we're using these terms for lack of better terms, but there are some parties on the left, but mainly it's right parties that are leading this wave. What do I see? So I see parties that are giving a voice to popular frustration with issues like immigration, net zero, and woke nonsense. And they should be praised for this. This is good. But is it enough? So to me, anti-wokeism and greater restrictions on immigration are only part of a successful populist strategy or populist program. These concerns are clearly just part of what is fueling support for these parties, but they're not everything. I think in many ways, these concerns are expressions of a deeper, socioeconomic and existential insecurity. They are the expression of a deep-seated frustration at the devastation caused to working class communities by decades of neoliberal economic policies. And unfortunately, when it comes to providing an alternative to the economic status quo, I find most right populist parties wanting. I find many of them wedded to the economic mainstream. I find them wedded to crude forms of economic liberalism, if not outright libertarianism, and crude forms of anti-statism. And in my opinion, this isn't going to cut it, because we need to understand that people, yes, they want less immigration and they want less woke bullshit, but they also want higher wages, better jobs, better social security, better welfare, higher pensions. And if that is so, and I think it is, and there's quite a lot of data to back that up, then I think the logical conclusion is that a kind of conservative right approach to cultural issues needs to go hand in hand with a left approach to economics. And I don't see any contradiction there. In fact, I would argue that the kind of social cohesion that conservatives cherish and want can only exist if the state intervenes to prevent the most destructive outcomes of unfettered capitalism, which is what has atomized to a large degree our societies. And I think this is an approach that, this kind of left-right populist synthesis is an approach that potentially could have massive electoral potential.
And yet, somewhat, strangely, it's virtually absent in the Western political panorama today, with the notable exception of Sarah Wagenknecht's party in Germany, which is doing incredibly well despite having just been created a few months ago. So maybe that tells us that she is moving in the right direction. And I think part of the reason why I think these parties aren't challenging the economic status quo. I mean, there are a number of reasons. It partly has to do with the fact that challenging the economic status quo in Europe today means challenging the institutional straitjacket that prevents any serious challenge to the economic status quo, i.e., obviously the European Union and especially the euro. And this brings me to my second criticism of today's populists, and that is that they're not radical enough, in my opinion, when it comes to challenging the European Union. In fact, that is shocking, in my opinion, that despite the European Union today having become, I would say, more dangerous than ever, especially now that it's becoming sort of an extended arm of NATO, virtually no populist party dares to openly talk of leaving the EU or the euro. This was somewhat different a few years ago. And I think this is tragic. I mean, this basically means that these parties are setting themselves up for defeat, because the European Union has a lot of tools to bring any populist government to heel. And we see that in Italy with Meloni. I think we've partly seen it already with Le Pen, which seems to have already watered down her program before even getting elected. And so, to sum up, I would say, we should cheer the continued rise of populism in Europe and beyond, but I still think there's a lot of work to do if we want to seriously challenge the status quo. Thank you.
Right. So excellent, Thomas. I'm very keen because it's been a while since we've actually heard Winston and Sabine, as it were, just because and also because I want the panelists to talk to each other, but I want them to talk to each other or, reflect on each other's thoughts via asking you, the audience. So what I'm going to do at the moment is, just for the first round, I'm just going to take 2 or 3 points, just so that I can then get the panelists to quickly reflect on those, but anything they want to respond to in relation to each other, and then I'll go back out. So let me take a few points. One thing I think is that, I can be disparaging about the likes of Keir Starmer talking about the snake oil of populism. And, somebody said in the Lords the other day after I spoke, the siren voices of populism, and kind of looked over at me and so on. But it's not as though I don't think there's a lot of snake oil about, right? It's also the case that there will be lots of people in this audience, if we're on it, we might not be the majority, but neither here nor there, who will be thinking, actually, I feel a bit uncomfortable about a lot of the populists, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, we shouldn't assume that everyone, and you should not feel that you can't say that. Right.
I just want to thank the panel for a fascinating intro. I was really touched by the bravery of Winston, actually, talking about grooming gangs, because I know the implications this has had on Andrew Norfolk, whose life was made absolute hell for exposing Rotherham. And then there was a coalition of leftist and Islamic organisations that essentially tried to cancel him by calling him a racist. The 2022 Telford inquiry into child sexual exploitation explained that this wasn't properly investigated because of nervousness about race. What this actually did was it emboldened the perpetrators and made the abuse ongoing. Tom Crowther, who was the QC at the time, indicated this abuse was intergenerational and involved men mainly of Pakistani heritage. Other inquiries, like the J inquiry into Rotherham, have said the same thing about the heritage of the perpetrators. They were predominantly the same. The point I want to make is that Sikh and Hindu girls have also been targeted. There was a case in 2013 where men with mainly Muslim names were convicted for the sexual exploitation of a Sikh girl above a restaurant in Leicester. And this has sadly previously resulted in vigilante action by a mob of Sikhs who attacked the restaurant and a number of people in there, and they were sent to prison. Do we not need to be more specific about the ethnicity of the perpetrators rather than using the weak term Asian, which covers a population of 5 billion?
If I can just pick up on an additional point to the one you've made, though, which is that you mentioned the phrase vigilantism. And I mean, and that was right. more and more I'm hearing people say that they should, as it were, take things into their own hands. And I don't know, the rise in the summer might indicate that's not necessarily where we want to be going. And then, of course, that's associated with populism or a populist reaction to the fact that the tone-deaf attitude of the politicians. So that's something to mull over.
This morning I was at a session about Orwell's 1984. Bruno chaired it. And we all know about the proles, how they were the majority of the population. They were just left to basically stew in their own piss. Nobody cared about them. And the discussion about populism today, and as Winston said it, the way we look at it, it's the people that were doing this stuff after the Southport killings. And what the question, I think, is if populism is that the people that feel underrepresented are trying to find a voice or trying to do something. I was at a session yesterday and it was actually you, Claire, that couldn't even bring yourself to mention Tommy Robinson's name. Like, is the populism that we might be looking at here so scary and so uncomfortable and unpalatable that we'd rather it didn't happen, and we would like it to be farmers and tractors or other people doing nice stuff?
I was joking about the not mentioning Tommy Robinson's name, by the way. But no, but it's true. And in fact, somebody actually, and this is quite interesting, I don't think he's here, but the person who actually reprimanded us from the audience, people won't necessarily know this, for saying, well, is there not a bit of snobbery that's going on in relation to Tommy Robinson? The guy who raised that point, other people won't have known, was a Momentum organizer from Salford, right? And it was kind of funny because I thought, we haven't declared who he is, but I know who he is. And he was actually saying, no, but he was rightly saying, you know what I mean? Like, we can't all go around like treating Tommy Robinson like he's the new problem either. I can't stand Tommy Robinson, this is the point. You could edit that out the film, but I'm just saying. So that's like, it's just like me. But anyway, that's it. Okay, I'm going to say, Winston, why don't you pick up anything you want from just those two, and then we'll go back out.
I'll pick up a couple of things. If I may, first of all, Roslyn, my co-panelist right at the other end, actually didn't give the full Oxford English Dictionary definition of populism. I know no one likes a pedant, but I think it is quite important that we get this right. She missed the second half of the definition. The first half, a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people, that's where she stopped, who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. That's key. And that's why Bernie Sanders is as much a populist as Donald Trump is a populist. The point from Hardeep Singh, I mean, you put it better than I even could, and I hope we can discuss that further later. We're having a session on the grooming games. Perhaps you should join that, and I invite you all to do that. But it seems to me the panel, we sort of discussed populism more than, or as much as I could hear. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear everything, but more than two-tier, and what the two-tier rule is. And I'm kind of curious about what that is, because you can't say that I wouldn't think that two-tier rule had any influence in Argentina. I'm not sure it did in El Salvador. And populism is completely different there. In Argentina, it's completely economic. In Salvador, it's economic and it's crime. In America, it is basically immigration, cultural, and economic. In each country in Europe, in the Netherlands, it's largely the BBB and the net zero, and net zero is an issue in all countries across the world, really. So populism takes different forms, as we've discussed, in each country. I'm kind of curious to hear more about two-tier rule from the specialists on the continent, actually, if you have insights there, because I think that's what I'm trying to work out, the relationship between two-tier and populism.
I feel guilty now because my colleague said, if you call it two-tier populism, everyone will get fetishized this thing. And I thought I was being clever. But if I could just explain one thing, which is what I wanted to get out of, or to think about in relation to the session, if you kind of read the blurb and everything. It's not the contemporary use of two-tier, but it was this. It seemed to me that because more and more people feel that there's a them and us, and they're the them, and so on, there's a kind of separation that's increasing. And actually, one of the ways that the politicians are dealing with them is to kind of tear them, tear them off into somewhere. I mean, it's true. It's not even quarantine, but it's just that, it's like them over there. I said in the introduction to this festival, penned in with a kind of notice up saying dangerous, do not engage, it's like that sort of like animals almost. That makes populism thrive. It's not like I'm not trying to be overly pedantic myself. I just want to explain that it's just trying to understand why, and that's really what I was trying to do. But Sabine, and then I'll just whiz along the panel. Anything you want to pick up?
Well, actually, I mean, I do think two-tier is interesting. I mean, it's very much a British discussion, but I had it in my introduction. I left it out. So the kind of leaving out the AFD from parliamentary working groups to me is a two-tier thing, and trying to establish institutions. They're talking about even the courts, kind of shielding the courts from populist influence. That's all very two-tier. I'm not sure, Winston, if I agree with you 100% that it's so different in all different countries. So I think the point that unites populists everywhere is that they are pushing against an establishment, and we have an establishment which is trying to determine the realm of the debate. So yesterday I was in a very interesting debate here on extremism. We had a Brazilian comrade speaking there, and he sort of mentioned a Brazilian judge who became very famous for pushing against Elon Musk. And, he said what a kind of authoritarian judge he was, how he was sentencing people for hate speech left, right, and center. And I remember this judge quite famous in Germany. He was hailed as a fantastic example of somebody who was brave enough to counter Elon Musk's free speech ideas. So this is an international establishment trying to make clear that we're all thinking in the same way. And this is why it was so important for me to write the book about Brexit, because believe me, Germans did not get any proper information on Brexit. They did not understand what was going on because they were not being informed. Because we have an international establishment, they're quite connected, and there are people pushing against them.
Can I agree with you in that comment then? So I do agree that what unites a lot of the populist movement is establishment worldview that includes it's basically the WF globalist worldview, which includes a weird relationship against free speech, better epitomized by Thierry Breton's bizarre open letter to Elon Musk before his spaces with Donald Trump, a disregard for sovereign nations, particularly the culture of sovereign nations, which we see expressed with immigration. So I do think that although there are different, and as I've already mentioned, this net zero ideology does seem to be across the board. So I agree with you on that there is a basket of these ideas that the establishment hold, but it takes different forms in different nations.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Thomas, anything you want to pick up quickly?
On the two-tier issue, I mean, I can't say it's a big deal in Italy. I can't say it's one of the driving elements behind the populist wave. And, I agree. I think it's very much a British thing. Maybe, but I think I'd maybe like to slightly, push back against this idea that this fundamentally is a left-right issue. And, I don't want to turn this into a debate, into a left-right debate, because I don't even, put myself on the contemporary left anymore. But I really do think the establishment is fundamentally non-ideological. So ultimately, it's about power, it's about class, it's about money, but ultimately raw power. And, but of course, for a long time, over the past decade, the kind of left liberal, kind of woke people have provided a lot of very useful ammunition to the establishment, to police the working classes, because, they sort of delegated the left with establishing the kind of parameters of acceptable debate. And that proved very useful in, using that as a battering ram against the working classes, to keep the working classes down, because it was thanks to the left now that we could accuse everyone of being racist and fascist and nationalist. But does that mean that, the people that were concocting these crazy ideas in universities, and the critical race theory courses or whatever, I mean, are we supposed to believe that these people are the elite, the real power elite? Obviously, they're not. I would say at best they were useful idiots whose ideas were then weaponized, very smartly by the real elites in order to police the working classes. But at the same time, I think, and it's the confirmation of that is that now, since the past year, we've seen a lot of those same people, the kind of woke leftists, in fact, finding themselves, and again, maybe this is not so much a British thing, but it's definitely, I think, in America and in other countries, they found themselves at the opposite kind of, end of the establishment's kind of, backs, because we have seen a lot of, censorship of, pro-Palestinian voices in universities, even in the UK. Just over the past, couple of months, we've seen a number of pro-Palestinian journalists who have had their houses raided by anti-terrorism police simply for covering what's happening in Gaza. And so I think this is just a reminder. Again, it's not about defending the left. I think it's about just a reminder of the fact that it would be a mistake to fall into this left-right trap, because I think we've seen a lot of people on the left that thought that they were the elites now finding themselves, in fact, on the receiving end of a lot of, repression and violence and censorship that they themselves were advocating for their political enemies until not too long ago. So I guess somewhat, some form of political justice, you could say. But still, I think it points to the fact that this is something that is somewhat post-ideological, in my opinion, to a certain extent.
That's very useful insight. Thanks, Thomas. Bruno?
Look, I think there's always this danger of the discussion on populism, that you focus too much on populists themselves and some of their obsessions or conspiracy theories or good ideas or bad ideas, because it's kind of missing the point. Now, the two-tier discussion, which has become sort of slightly totemic, a bit like the word woke, it's sort of almost a ritual cry, is simply the realization that we live in societies, in countries, nations, have become much more ruled by inequality. Again, one of the vehicles for developing new forms of inequality has been multiculturalism, and it's divided people. It creates the safe spaces, separation of identities, border between identities, but really fundamentally creates this idea that most people are moral inferiors in any way, in some way, shape or form. So the perception of inequality is important, but inequality has been around a long time. What is the antidote to inequality? Is it, like Tommy Robinson and the English Defence League getting a big march and having a good ruck, a bit like the good old days, the Intercity Firm and West Ham and all Millwall and all that kind of nonsense? Or is it a civic culture? Is it democracy? Is it freedom? So in civic culture is really, really important, because in civic culture, in democracy, in the realm of free speech, an argument, there are no moral inferiors, there are no superiors. No one's idea is better than your ideas. By definition, you have to thrash that out through argument. Even an election doesn't satisfy or doesn't finish the debate. That's really important to think about civic culture, democracy. It's the realm of equality. It's what levels us. We are all the same. We all have one vote. Yeah, one person, one vote is the realm of equality. It's the realm of equality between men and women, any divisions that exist in society. We're all equal because we have that vote. And that is why civic culture is important. That's why it's important. And that's why it's so threatening to political elites. And that's why they have to somehow portray and turn, in terms of ideology, the civic space into something ethnic, into something dangerous in of itself, because they can't accept that politics is rationality of individuals pursuing conscious interests. They want to try and identify the civic space, the way we interact, as being something deeper, irrational, national, ethnic, racial. Civic culture, but key to understanding populism is its threat to the established order is because it is totally based on civic culture. It's totally a rebellion at the ballot box. That's its strength, and that's why it's important, because that is the realm of equality.
Okay, thank you, Roslyn.
Yeah, thanks.
I know you want to clap in, but don't. He got it. Right, Roslyn. Right, get ready to put your hands up. About one round. Yeah, go on.
Well, when we think of the establishment, we also often think of something, very boring and cut and dried. But interestingly, our establishment has become an establishment that itself is perpetuating chaos and destabilization. To address the issue of vigilantism, in our democracies or in our states up until now, we have ways to channel people's conflicts, to channel people's problems. Everyone should know what to do or where to go if they have a problem. I have a problem, I go to this authority, or I do this to try to address that problem. When we stop that, when people don't have those channels, everything explodes. Winston, I think he was talking a bit about Argentina, as it so happens my mother is from Argentina. So I would argue that all of these things with populism and destabilization, they didn't happen in Argentina. They just happened much earlier. And is why my mother didn't keep living in Argentina. I mean, one of the first things my mother told me, she said, one of the first memories I have of my life is just, I saw a lady get run over in the street and no one did anything about it. She's like, that's one of the first things I remember seeing. And that's what life was like in Argentina. And that's why I went. So we do see this increased destabilization, which I worry about more and more and more, because it doesn't take much for things to explode and get nasty, as Claire was saying. The other thing, the two-tier issue. Well, I think there is a segment of society, as I've said, that does feel that their interests are being cared for. I do think that we spend too much time when we discuss populism, discussing the populists, and not discussing what is the other side of that, as I've said today with the courtiers. I think there is a segment of society that feels that their interests are being taken care of, probably erroneously, probably misguidedly, but they do have that feeling. And as long as that is the case, that is the constituency that the establishment will continue to try to appeal to and continue to use to sort of keep everyone else apart and keep people from having a communication, like a kind of network of communication. We used to just be able to say, if we had an article to write, I'm just going to write the article and I'll send it off to an editor. They'll probably print it. That does not happen anymore. It's very, very, very hard to get anything published today that is not just a repetition of some kind of quite vague propaganda and repeating the line of the paper very slavishly, really. So we've kind of lost our communication channel as a society, and I think that is, again, just really, really, really dangerous. Fine, I'll stop there. Since.
Okay, thank you. No, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Okay, yeah, yes.
I think the last point was exactly where I was, which is it's about the communications. I think we're at a distinct disadvantage as a group. I know last night I spoke to lots of people with completely different viewpoints to my own, and I found a warmth with them because they sold it differently. And the thing is that the media so much shapes, depending on what media I'm reading and what circles I'm moving within. Take, for instance, the Thatcher years. I was in Hong Kong and she seemed like a nice lady. I came back, I now live in Blackpool, and she is absolutely hated, depending on who you're speaking to and who was touched by the policies that hurt, and how that was then portrayed in the press. And as I say, in Hong Kong, we saw it as a nice lady with a handbag trying to make those nasty people go back to work. And it just depended on where you were and what you perceived. So I can understand the panel's points. And I also think that one of the things you said earlier, which was about being anti-establishment, is what populism is. Well, isn't that also what activism is? And aren't we therefore all in the same pot? Because I'm here as an activist and speaking later, and I kind of feel like I'm on the outside of the group, but I think I'm no different from the populist parties. I'm just fighting the establishment.
And that's an interesting question, isn't it? So who has a microphone now?
Are riots inevitable following the upcoming American election, regardless of who wins and who loses?
There you go. Are riots inevitable following the American elections, regardless of who wins? It's fatalistic. But anyway, yes, sir.
Hi, Hugo de Berg. The reason we in Britain are talking about populism here today, worrying about populism, is surely because of the revulsion that the British electorate felt against permanent career politicians, the political class. And yet, extraordinarily enough, this is something which none of the so-called populists have addressed. We have tried to address immigration. People have tried to address the economic inequality that's referred to up there. But who has talked about changing the system which makes our elite, our political elite, completely unrepresentative of the people who wanted to vote for Brexit, the people who want immigration policies to be stricter, and so on, and so on, and so on. And there are ideas about that around. There are people who are suggesting that we shouldn't have legislators who are also career ministers. We should have a different system. We should be thinking about that, because this is the really important question. If we don't want violence on the streets, such as we experienced recently, to get bigger and bigger, And as Germany and Italy and other European countries experienced in the 1920s and 1930s, we have to solve this problem, the disjuncture between the professional political class and the people who want something better.
Okay, thank you very much. As I say, there's a couple of hands down there that I can't see.
I think the word that's missing from the conversation so far is agency. And in the political arena, I think what that means is what we say goes, even if it goes against you. And it seems to me that the ruling elite has tried to award itself a monopoly on agency. And it's allocated another tier of people who are not allowed agency, but they are allowed identity. And they are, in effect, the clientele with the elite as their patrons. And then there's the third group, which here in this room we're primarily interested in, who are denied both agency and identity. Because the problem with their heritage is that it reeks of, inherent in it, is the possibility of their agency, their tradition, that heaven forbid that they should reclaim the tradition of social democracy, for example, and say to the elite, what we say goes, even if it goes against you. So anyone who makes stakes in that group, who stakes a claim on agency, is dubbed a populist. But one of the problems for populism in its attempt to reclaim agency is where can it go in the attempt to reclaim this that doesn't simply hark back to the past? How can it avoid looking at the future through the rear view mirror?
Thank you.
I want to refer to what Bruno had to say about the growth of the EU. I found his description of the growth of the EU quite frightening. He seems to paint a picture of an EU elite which is beyond the control of the member states. It has achieved a kind of autonomy of its own. It's now acting as a superpower, which sees itself as above the power of the member states to control it. It uses democracy only as a kind of a useful tactic, at times to further its own interest, but not as a basic foundational principle which can actually control the EU itself. I wonder if you would care to say whether or not this monolith is still capable of being brought under control and how it might be possible to do this.
Okay, thank you for that.
Hi, my name is Mike. I'm a populist. I don't despise the term at all. At the time of the Brexit referendum, I was a member of UKIP. I campaigned for Brexit. I don't hate Europeans. I don't hate black people. I once had a Dutch girlfriend. And,
this is like my best friend and my neighbour, isn't it? Right, carrying on.
I'll only say on that score that the memory recedes, though occasionally I do get flashbacks. And so I know perfectly well. I know perfectly well that the anti-populist narrative, the establishment is a pack of lies. And if you remember at the time the Brexit final Brexit negotiations were going on, there used to be a lot of UKIP flags flying over Parliament Square, of the Greens, or opposite Parliament. I used to help take those down each night, and I did so in the company of a splendid man called Elvis, who sadly is no longer alive. He died of COVID. But Elvis was an Iranian Christian who'd actually fought on the Iranian side in the Iran-Iraq war. So there you are, an Iranian Christian whose father was a high-ranking officer in the Iranian army, and me, whose father was the corporation patron decorator in Preston. That was the reality of the politics of Brexit and of populism at the time. So I know that the anti-populist narrative put forward by the establishment, as I said, is a pack of lies. So I've got a very simple question. Given that the what is obviously the whole tenor of this session is that narrative is failing, do the members of the panel think that, as has been suggested, the establishment might go a step further and actually try to proscribe the narrative against actually trying to proscribe parties like Reform.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi. Yeah, I'd like to talk about the impact of social media on this, and particularly things like Twitter. So, say, for example, if you're not on Twitter, you just read The Guardian and the BBC, you'll have a very different idea, I think, of reality and what's happening than if you are on Twitter. So, for example, when the election was announced, Reform was trending every single day for weeks. It was obvious if you were seeing that there was going to have a big impact on the election. And it's things like the difference between, say, I got into this whole freedom of speech thing because of the whole transgender ideology. So if you're seeing a serious crime reported and the media's saying this is a man, and everyone say, actually, no, this is a woman, there's a real disconnect. And people can see actually what's happening, and they can see footage of things. They're not just influenced by what is in the paper, what they see on TV. And I think people can also get radicalized very easily through things like social media, because obviously there's the disinformation as well. So it's like, where do those two kind of interconnect, really?
Thank you very much.
Just a quick one on the two-tier. After the George Floyd situation, we were all educated or re-educated about how one group is treated differently to another group, and how that is in our country as well. But then this summer, we were then told, actually, there isn't a two-tier.
The establishment throughout Europe and the US seems to me to have failed to deliver anything useful economically for the last 20 years. Whether that's infrastructure, hospitals, schools, inequality, growing the economy, none of that has worked. And many of the things they have said has been disinformation to hide their failure in this. It seems to me that for populist parties to be successful in the long run, they too will need to find a solution to this problem, which will drive success, because it's ordinary people that bear the cost of those failures.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very good debate. I don't know when all the populism stuff started in this country, but as a Yorkshireman, I certainly remember very clearly when Gordon Brown went to Yorkshire and he referred to that woman as bigoted. And the north-south divide became rather obvious at the time, particularly as all the media is based in the south of England. But everyone in Yorkshire and Lancashire knew exactly what that woman was talking about. And I think that this was an indication of what was going to happen, that the establishment was going to treat the people as if they're stupid and don't know what their issues are. And in every election ever since then, we've seen the same messages that the people don't know what they're talking about, and we know better. And it wasn't a surprise, as a Yorkshireman, it wasn't a surprise for me when Brexit went through, because everyone in the North, it wasn't that they were anti-Europe, they were anti-establishment. And I think that might indicate the move to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, great debate. I think we've heard that populism is a very heterodox movement and coalitions, perhaps incoherent coalitions in many ways. I want to go slightly near the third rail, play on the tracks, because there's been a little bit of discussion of ethnicity in the platform, but I think it's mostly been in terms of saying well, it's not really to do with that. My suggestion would be that one of the things, in addition to questions around democracy, living standards, two-tier justice, it seems to me, as an observer, that one of the things that is encouraging this populist sort of movement is a greater interest to revaluation of European ethnicities. So these ethnicities have become contested through the existence of multicultural, multi-ethnic societies. But it seems to me that the populist energy is partly to do with Europeans reasserting, reconsidering and revaluing their ethnicities. Now, you can think that's good, you can think that's bad, you can think that's potentially good and bad, but I think it's hard to deny that that's part of what it's about. My suspicion is you people on the platform are going to be thinking more and more about that over the coming years. Each year this happens. In 5 years' time, I think it will be more of an overt issue than it is now. And I want to know what the platform thinks about that side of things. sort of the ethnic aspect of populism?
So, two-tier policing, I would say, yes, we have to appeal, and people are shocked by what's been happening, clearly. We have to appeal to a sort of an objective standard of justice for all. But one of the problems with the debate about what to do about two-tier policing has been a call for more crackdown equally on everyone. And actually, that's a problem because, you know, if one wants to support the right to protest for all, even if we don't like what another group's saying, that's less policing, less crackdown. So I'd be interested in what the panel think about that.
Some of you will know that from my accent, I'm Irish, but I've lived in Belgium for 10 years, and I've lived here for 10 years. I've been an employer in all three countries, and have some knowledge of the US economy as well. I witness the division of wealth as being much better in Ireland and Belgium than in the UK and the US. How important is economic inequality in this debate?
Yes, it's. I mean, it's been referred to by the panelists, but I think that it's a perfectly reasonable question. Let's forget the economy question in this whole discussion. And I'm going to take the panelists in reverse order. I wanted to just reflect on the weighing up the ethnicity question, valuing ethnicities as it was described. I mean, I'm not interested in valuing ethnicities, but I do know that that's the obsession of the identitarian, new left, which sadly some people on the right seem to be wanting to imitate, which is that they think that the most important thing about somebody is their ethnicity or their skin color, and they want to reduce us all to that. The least interesting aspect of our personalities, it seems to me, is our ethnicity, and it tends to be those people who've got less scintillating personalities who seem to want to value ethnicity because they haven't got very much else to value. I'm personally not interested. I do think, however, that it's becoming more important in the absence of politics or these kind of discussions because nobody knows where else to go, right? So you end up with a narrative that's unhelpfully not going to get us anywhere. It's not, however, simple enough because I made the joke that I'm a populist and everyone says, oh, you're populist. And I say, yes, I am and all that. But I'm actually also quite critical of some of the populist movements and parties around because they do insult the intelligent people by oversimplifying stuff. It's also the case that I don't also want to sound like I'm a snob who thinks the only thing that matters is the ballot box, and if you have a riot, you're the wrong type of person. I've been known on occasion to be involved in street politics. I mean, it's not like I can think, oh, all those people who go out and protest, can you imagine how disgusting, right? So it's a balance here. It's complicated, right? So I generally believe in democratic, civic protest via the ballot box, and that's what I believe in. But I'm certainly not going to go, and therefore I'd never understand why anyone would ever get involved in a street fight. Of course you would. That's how social change has happened over the years. But it's also the case that a lot of the kind of populist warfare is frightening me, right? It's not like I want to emulate the rioters post-Southport. It's just that I can understand how it happens. I didn't mean to say that I want to go, well, let's all rush down to a hotel now as the obvious way to explain what our concern about national sovereignty, border control, and so on. So we have to have these conversations out and not be frightened to say things that might be unpopular, and also to think out loud and say, I don't know what the answer is. That's why we've got the battle of ideas, so that we can go, I don't know what the answer is. In reverse order, can I see, Thomas, your final thoughts, please?
So maybe I'll touch upon the issue of professional politicians, and I mean that's something that was a big debate in Italy with the 5-star movement, and a big part of their kind of agenda and program was we should take ordinary people into parliament, and that was the idea, and they implemented it in the sense that especially in the first round of they got into parliament, a lot of ordinary people, working class people, did get in with zero experience in politics, and but that turned out to be a complete disaster. because of course they were completely gobbled up by the professional politicians and by the technocrats. So, I think that's a really complex issue. I mean, the problem is that if you're the only one doing it, then you're screwed. So of course, if we're talking a systemic change, then that's a different matter. So everyone's at least on a level playing field. But then again, I do fear that some level of professionalism is required in politics if you don't want to end up being kind of overrun by the technocrats. But I mean, it is an issue that's worth discussing. I mean, we're facing a much bigger issue, and that is really just the extent to which democracy is rigged in Western countries today. And I think that's something that as populists, we shouldn't be afraid to discuss, because of course that doesn't mean that the alternative is, rioting or armed insurrection. But at the same time, I think talking about the, clear limits to democratic electoral politics today in the West is necessary, because I think the game is clearly rigged. It's rigged at the, at the level of propaganda and censorship. It's rigged at the level of just how hard, the conditions placed the entry into the political system. Simply put, the money that's necessary to raise resources that are needed to create a political party today are a huge problem. We've seen it's rigged at the level of, if a candidate gets too far, we will stop him by whatever means necessary. And, regardless of whether one agrees with his opinions or not, this is clearly what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. But there are other examples on the other side of the political spectrum in other European countries. We've heard, talks of banning the AfD. So, I mean, I think this is an issue that really we have to reflect on more deeply, because, for example, ignoring that issue is what, to some extent, has led to the death of populism in a country like Italy, like my country, where no one truly believes after this huge surge in populism, probably the biggest kind of, and definitely one of the first big populist surges in 2018, which led to the creation of this, populist government formed, as a result of an alliance between a five-star movement, kind of leftish, movement party, and the Northern League, right-wing party. I mean, this was really a novel experiment, which had the backing of more than 30% of the electorate, ended up in a complete disaster because they had ignored those sort of structural restraints that are placed on governments these days. And the end result was that, the government pretty much collapsed after a year. And nowadays in Italy, hardly anyone really believes that populism can solve anything. So,
Thank you. Salutary tale, brilliant thoughts. Thanks very much, Thomas. Roslyn, your kind of final minute, please.
Yeah, I probably have a somewhat more favorable opinion of the five-star movement in Italy, because they were working against huge headwinds, and they did actually achieve what people said was impossible for a long, long time, which was to get elected on that mandate and actually be basically the government of Italy for a long time. As I understand it, I think the mistake that the five-star movement made was to kind of not take a far enough step back from the representative politics, because I believe one of their major schisms was actually over whether people who were elected could continue to hold office. Originally, they were supposed to only have 2 terms, I think, and then they had to step back and let someone else take their seat. And then they had this schism over that, and some people obviously, once elected, wanted to stay on. So if anything, that was kind of their fatal mistake in the end. I do think that we can't just say, oh, politics is rigged, and what do we, that's just something, let's just keep talking about that. I do think we have to ask, what can you do about it? You can't just sit here and let things get worse. It's kind of similar to the anti-vest or the five-star movement. I have been involved in a lot of direct democracy projects and experiments also online. I do think that a lot of them have turned out, it's not necessarily going in the direction it should go, but they have turned out quite well from the point of view of the participation. What you will get out of that is typically the people who participate will start really looking at expenses. This is probably like the number one thing people do, is to start looking for how the government is wasting money. What is the value that you're getting out of things? It's not like they're for or against anything. It's just about examining that, not wasting money, bringing stuff back under control, rather than just letting things take off down a path that later has no explanation. Everyone's annoyed that a lot of money was wasted and no one really understood what they got out of it. So I think when you think about populism, you also have to think, who controls corruption? Who puts a lid on corruption, legalized corruption, wasting of money? That happens through millions of people being involved, scrutinizing every one of those choices. So I think it's very beneficial to have that. I mean, in Ireland, obviously, we have referendums all the time. much more often than in Britain, of course, much more often. And when we have those referendums, I think what goes well for us in Ireland is that our politicians do respect that. Even when they lose a referendum, which happens relatively often, they will say, well, that's what people decided, so that's it. I mean, yes, they do cynically sometimes rerun them with minor changes and try to get what they want anyway, but that overt sense of, well, you're just a bunch of idiots and I'm sorry I asked, is not something that you would get in our country. You definitely do get the, fine, whatever, people have spoken, we need to move on to the next thing now. And I think that helps to constructively keep moving things in a way that's forward and not just through this endless loop of everyone screaming at everybody and nobody knows who's responsible for anything, and we just keep seeming to muddle on that way.
Okay, thanks very much, Roslyn. Yes.
Right,
yeah, go on, quick, yeah. Sorry, clap all for everyone at the end, yeah.
So 28th of April 2010, someone mentioned it, very important moment in British politics. Gillian Duffy in Rochdale bumped into Gordon Brown. They have an encounter. She's asked by a journalist how it went. She said, oh, he's a very nice man. I've always voted Labour for my whole of my life. He gets into a car, he's still got a Sky News microphone attached to it, which he doesn't really know. He's asked about the encounter. He says it was absolutely disaster. And he says with the kind of doom that only Gordon Brown can conjure up, she was just a bigoted woman. The rest is history. So what populism is exactly a civic response to that sense of superiority, where Gordon Brown meets someone and they actually had a conversation about control over borders, which is a civic issue, not an ethnic issue. He thought she was bigoted because she wanted to talk about that, and he was expressing this superiority that the elites have over us. We are bigots. We are white, horrible, ethno-nationalist bigots, and they need to create these supranational institutions that stand above us, that are superior to us, to rein us in. So the equation of national politics, which is where politics is, where we are, as xenophobic and ethno-nationalism, is really, it's a really, really negative development. It really, really heralds the rise of a new kind of multicultural, multi-tiered, unequal society. And the people who play that game, the morons who are around, who are ethno-nationalists, actually want to live in that world. They want to live in a multicultural world. In fact, but they just want to be the dominant ones, not the Muslims, the made-up Muslims that the elites like. So what's really, really important is people do not play that game. Populist revolt is a civic revolt. It is not an ethno-nationalist revolt. The idea it is entirely an elite fantasy, a dystopia, and it's very, very dangerous because it is about the abolition of politics. Politics is not ethnic.
Yes. I don't believe the populists have the solution to the problems. I mean, some of the points you made, I certainly don't believe that. Some of the solutions they're proposing are pretty nutty. So, for example, the left populists in Germany want to make the country dependent on Russian oil again. That's not the reason why we support the populists, but they have raised the issues we need to talk about. So the fact we're talking about two-tier policing is because of the populists. The fact that we're talking about cancel culture is because of the populists. And one of the reasons why we have right populism is because of cancel culture, because who's going to be engaged in politics and voice their opinion if they're going to be stopped immediately by the establishment? So it's so important to push against all these rules. And I think I like to look at populism as a movement, as a process. The populists themselves one day are going to have to vie for the voice of the people themselves. They're going to have to explain their politics. And they're going to come under pressure, and they have come under pressure, and they've exposed themselves in parts as being phony populists. And that's why we have two populist parties now in Germany. They're competing with each other, and that's a very good thing. And that's why I think we're on the right side, and we say we support the populists, even if we don't believe that they have the solutions.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And then finally, Winston.
I'll conclude just by coming back to our original question. Is populism a response to two-tier rule? We've explored the many forms of populism across the world. And in my opening statement, I tried to argue that grooming gangs was part of the two-tier rule that inspired the populism in this country. If I didn't persuade you, well, I can assure you that the two-tier rule we are now seeing will inspire more populism in this country for better or worse.
Thank you very much. Brilliant panel.